Alright, so now that you know all the different ways that you can simplify and describe your data, you can get ready to begin doing all that kind of data analysis, building your frequency distribution tables, drawing up your charts and things like that. But before you conduct any of those kinds of analyses, there's a few things you should do. So the first thing you're going to want to make sure that you take care of before you get started is you want to ensure that your data, like your spreadsheets and all the stuff you've collected, you want to make sure that there isn't any information in there that might identify who your individual participants are. That's a common practice for most studies. You want to just make sure that everything is kept anonymous. Next thing you're going to want to do is just make sure before you start doing this analysis that you have some place that you can safely store the data you've collected. You don't want to, have some kind of strange thing happen and then suddenly your data gets lost or stolen or destroyed. You want to make sure you make backups and you keep it in a nice, safe, secure place. That also goes for any kind of participant consent forms or any contracts or anything you may have needed to sign. Just make sure you keep copies of all of those things in a nice, safe place. And like I mentioned, it's not just about securing the original stuff. You should also make backups. So that's another common practice, is to back up the data. You can have, the paper documents, you can have electronic documents on your computer, and you should also have like a backup off-site, like on a secure cloud server or something like that. But there is one other thing you're going to want to do. One extremely important thing you're going to want to do before you conduct those analyses, and that is to take a long, hard look at your data and try to find any problems that might be in there. Because more often than not, you're going to have a few problems that you need to deal with before you can get started. So checking the raw data is incredibly important. There's many problems that you might find. There's many things that might be things you have to deal with in the data, such as data that's missing. Like maybe you have a few participants that just didn't answer all the questions. You have to decide what you're going to do about it. Like, are you going to just reject that entire participant? Or are you going to try to guess at what their response likely would have been? Like, you need to make those kinds of decisions. You need to figure out how you're going to deal with missing data. Another thing that you'll most likely come across, especially if you're doing survey research, is trying to make sense of illegible responses. Quite often participants, when you allow them to write in their thoughts, or when you have them, circle an answer or something like that, they might circle more than one answer, or maybe they'll circle something that's not even an answer, and you need to figure out what you want to do about that. If a participant consistently produces these illegible responses, you should probably just, throw that data away, just reject that participant's data. But often, if you spend a little time and effort, you can try to figure out what they were trying to tell you. But one that definitely should lead to you throwing out that participant's data is any kind of obvious misunderstandings they may have had. Like if they didn't seem to understand what the question was asking them. If their response does not match the question, then obviously that participant's data is not accurate. It should be rejected. But yeah, in general, it's up to you to decide how you want to deal with all of this kinds of problems. When you do find problems like this in the raw data, you're going to have to make those calls on your own. You're going to have to use your best judgment. Maybe you should talk to your collaborators, like your mentor or supervisor or whatever. But typically it's up to you to decide what you want to do with it. And whatever you do decide to do with it, make sure you mention that. in your research report. Just mention, some participants didn't respond correctly to such and such, and that data was rejected. Whatever. Now, after you check the raw data, after you check to find any errors in the data, the next step before you really get started with your analysis is to organize it into some kind of sensible way. This is before you do frequency distributions. I'm just talking about basic organization of the raw data. And there's a typical way we do this. There's a standard format for this kind of organization. And it looks like this. So you can see in this table over here, we have a few different columns and multiple rows. The columns all have titles. So you have P number, group, score, and time. And then the rows just have numbers in them. This is the most common way we organize our data in psychology and in most sciences. So we have individual trials or individual participants on each row. So one row per participant. And then each column is a different variable. So the first variable is the participant number. The second variable is what group they were in. The third variable is what score they earned. And the fourth variable in this case would be how much time they took. And just in general, you want to put any kind of identifying variable, like grouping variable, for example, like whether they were in the treatment group or the control group. You want to put those kinds of variables first, and the more continuous quantitative variables, like how much time they took or what score they've earned or something like that, you want to put those later on. So you want to, on the left side of your spreadsheet, you just want all that kind of identifying stuff over there. And I mentioned previously that we commonly use programs like Microsoft Excel, spreadsheet software like that, but Google Sheets also works perfectly well. Google Sheets is absolutely free and it works just as well. So that's another great way to organize your data. But just to give you an example of what I mean, I am very familiar with Microsoft Excel. Here's what your spreadsheet might look like. So you can see the participant is in the participant's initials. You shouldn't really have initials, actually. That's not such a great practice. But the participant's initials I have in the first column, and then in the following columns I have their scores for each of these different conditions. So one row per participant and one column per variable. What I should really do is just change those participant initials to numbers. So like AC would be number 1, AK would be number 2, and so on. And then there's one final thing that you should probably do before you really get started with your analyses, before you actually conduct those analyses, and that is to do a preliminary analysis. And there's several preliminary analysis you could conduct, such as just trying to assess the internal consistency of your measures or evaluating each variable's distribution. There's a lot of different things that you should probably just take a quick look at. I mean, it's not hard to just try to find things like outliers and potentially remove those before you do the primary analysis, before you try to answer your research questions. So these are just good quality control kind of measures. All right, so that's the basic idea. You just want to check to make sure the data doesn't have any problems with it, deal with any of those problems that might show up, and just make sure the data is ready to go. Make sure you have good, clean data before you start answering your research questions. That is the ultimate goal here, remember. You do want to answer those research questions, but you don't want to rush into it. You want to make sure that you've ironed out all of the problems before you try to accomplish that goal. All right?